Good morning and welcome to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if the Abbasid Empire reached the space age. The Abbasid Empire was without a doubt one of the most powerful Islamic empires that existed in history. It was also the successor of the Umayyid Empire. The Abbasid Empire is famous for many things, and many scientific advances were made in that time. While the Umayyid Empire was mostly Arabic and tried to impose Islam in many brutal ways, the Abbasid Empire was a bit different at the beginning. The Umayyad Empire transcended into the Abbasid Empire because of the so-called revolt of the Abbas ibn Abd al-Muttalib. So he was the guy who led a revolt, and it was also supported by many minorities because this revolt was exploiting the differences between many society classes and many ethnic groups. They didn't really get more autonomy at the end, the minorities, but many non-Arabs were accepted into higher ranks within the government, for instance, such as the Persians. There is a famous quote from al-Ma'um, which says, "The Persians ruled for 1,000 years and did not need us Arabs even for a day. We have been ruling them for 1 or 2 centuries and cannot do without them for an hour," which pretty much explains how the situation was in those days. Indeed, the Abbasid Empire relied in many ways and in many cases on their minorities. The Persians did great advances in mathematics, for instance. In there, I can name the example of algebra. And Nestorian Christians, they were one of the first who actually made translations from the old Greek works or literature into Syriac and then into Arabic. Papermaking, explosive gunpowder, and even windmills were spreading throughout the Abbasid Empire. Papermaking and the explosive gunpowder, they came all from China, whereas the windmills, this was more something which was invented within their own realm. Ironically, the Arabization also spread within the Abbasid Empire, and I say ironically because at first the Abbasid rebellion was exploiting on the differences that existed within the many non-Arab and Arab ethnicities, and the non-Arabic minorities, they tried to support the rebellion of Abbas because they thought they could get more autonomy, which at the end did not really happen. So to give you one point or one better understanding how the Abbasid Empire looked like, I'm gonna draw you a little map. And the Abbasids, they were, let's say, around this area. So all of this here was kind of the Abbasid Empire. So you have North Africa, you have Egypt, of course, Arabia, the Fertile Crescent, so Syria, Iraq, and also parts of Iran. nowadays, and then of course, well, Iran, which was also known as Persia back then. Which points of divergence would we take? One of them would be that the Abbasid Empire needed to centralize and have a more absolutistic monarch. Without a central authority, the empire would become fragmented as it did in our timeline. At the same time, many faraway places would likely still break away, as it would be too costly to preserve these areas. The monarch would need to keep areas close to his main residence, where most of the tax revenue comes from, as well as resources. These places would be then Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and parts of Persia, the so-called Fertile Crescent or Crescent. So let's say all of this area in here, this black area, would actually become the main part where they will hold their power. And I will also go so far and take most of Arabia, because Islam came, of course, from Arabia originally. So you will have this area in here, this core area, let's say, where the Abbasid Empire would most likely always try to hold their power in our alternative timeline. Another aspect would be that their armies would need to become more Arabized or Arabic, and also accepted within the higher social ranks, because otherwise you will have adventures like, let's say, with the Mamluks, where they just did their own thing, they became their own force, and then they just basically made their own empire, the Mamluk Empire. The most important point in here would probably be the Mongols in this alternate timeline. Yeah, the Mongols are very famous and they reappear many times in many different alternate history scenarios. With a more efficient army, a centralized government, and a bit of luck, it is possible for the Abbasid Empire to fight toe-to-toe against the Mongols, or just lose temporarily some of their lands. So let's say the Mongols, they invade, they take all of this here away until they come here against the Byzantines, and this would mean one or two things. The Abbasids and the Byzantine would have in fact an alliance, as unlikely as it sounds, but I think in a way the Christians and the Muslims, they would rather prefer to ally against someone who is like from really far away and where they don't know nothing about. And also the Mongols, they were totally pagan, so at least for the Muslims, even the Christians were not really Muslims, but they were from a religion of the book. As for the Christians, as much as they disliked the Muslims, but somehow they could still tolerate them in a bit better way than someone who is totally pagan. Now that Baghdad in that case would be secured, as well as the Byzantine Empire, the Abbasid Empire would most likely try to regain their old lands and their former territories. And, well, they would still be at odds with the different successors of the Mongol Empire, because, well, the Mongols, they have a lot of problems, they get up many civil wars, they don't have really specific laws that explain how each heir should take the empire or inherit it, and thus you will have like many tiny states, even here, and so on, which would fight against each other. This time it would not only be the Ottomans who would cut off the trade, but this time the Mongols would cut off the trade. The Abbasids, they would thus be forced to focus on their sea routes, and they would likely make trade through the sea and then go to India or parts of East and Southeast Africa. And because they were forced then to go and do the trade through the sea, it would be them, the Abbasids, who would actually make discoveries and technological in this technological area of the navy instead of the Portuguese. It would also come in handy for them, as they would be able to have a better communication system, especially around Arabia, if we consider the desert and all of that. Muslim merchants in our timeline, they went to places as far as Indonesia, for instance, and some even believe that they went until Australia. Well, it's still very speculative, but let's say it's not unlikely, because Indonesia and Australia are very close to each other. And with such a vast improvement in the navy, the Abbasids would well expand beyond their borders in places such as Eastern and Southeastern Africa, as well as India and Indonesia, for instance. Spreading Islam would always remain like a top priority for them. But with the improved navy technology, trade would gain more and more in importance. So it would not just be like a few merchants who would go here and there, but actually it would be more centralized, where even the main government would sponsor trips or trade trips to this and this area, and thus they would also likely have bigger ships where they could bring more things. And once you have like a good place where you like to do trade, you want to also control this area. And if you want to control it, you have different ways how you can do it. And not only would you, let's say, Islamize it as a Muslim, but you would also probably try to colonize it by sending your own people in there. And therefore we would see a much bigger Arabization, because the colonization and Arabization, they would go hand in hand in this time. So you would have actually all of this here would, let's take this away for a moment. You would have areas like in here, and then also, well, even maybe Madagascar, and then also areas beyond, like parts of India, where they would take some cities as Portugal did with Goa, and maybe Sri Lanka, and many more islands that exist in that route. Europe, on the other hand, they would become very backwards. They would remain backwards. The plague would still spread, because the trade would now be overseas and done by the Abbasid Empire. At the same time, with the survival of Byzantium, many scholars, they wouldn't flee to Venice, and the Renaissance would probably be delayed or happen in a different way, where actually the death of all those people would trigger a change in the feudal system, but not with the cultural and also the intellectual aspect that revolved around the Renaissance. With the trade still occurring, it is questionable whether Portugal or Spain would try to find their luck in a new trade route. And it's also actually questionable if they would exist at all, but I would say they would still kinda exist, because maybe the Abbasids, they would be still too busy doing other stuff. It's also possible that they would just be part of the Abbasid Empire and become something like a province of Al-Andalus. Islam would have to reform in certain ways, because after a certain time the Christian societies, they surpassed the Muslim societies, because there were many changes that happened. So they were not very static, but actually they changed a lot. We're not talking about the Reformation in the style of Protestantism, for instance, because remember, in Christianity there were many movements that happened around, and I will not go into detail, don't worry. But at least some reform should come in such a way that minorities, for instance, they wouldn't have the need to flee or fear for their lives, as it happened a few times in those Islamic empires. And they could actually, like this, also contribute to the empire, because when you force certain people to go away, they can of course not contribute for you, which is very logical. Sharia law, for instance, could be changed in such a way that it would replace the Codex Justianus in that timeline. So it would become, in our timeline, for instance, the Codex Justianus is like the main inspiration for the laws that exist around in the world, at least, well, for our societies. But let's say if Sharia law would be changed in some ways, or be changing during decades or centuries, I would say, it is very possible that the Sharia law would globally be accepted as some kind of inspiration for laws. With a society ready to change step by step, the Abbasid Empire could take a similar outlook as, let's say, the British Empire. They would possess a large sea empire, be focusing on trade, and make contribution in philosophy, ideologies, and societal issues. It is also very likely that slavery would become abolished if they followed the same path as Britain. So if they would be able to change Sharia law a little bit and also have changes within their society, I also see that slavery would after some point be seen as very bad, and that they would try to at least repress it or change it in different ways, where at the end it would just be abolished altogether. As I said before, the Abbasid already used windmills, and with their improved naval technology, they could actually trigger an industrial revolution with that kind of technology. However, also with the gunpowder and the oil, it would be very possible that many advances would be made very easily. I'm actually sure that the Abbasid Empire would be able to develop small balloons, planes with ease, if all these conditions were met. They would certainly support these technologies as they needed it for the communication within the empire, which was very big and would spread not only a lot in their land, but it would also have a lot of islands and thus would also depend on the sea. The telegraph would certainly find a big use in this alternate Abbasid Empire. Cars would start to roll and become important for the traders, decreasing the time between many cities of the desert, for instance, and also ships would be improved. War would certainly happen, and an alternative World War I or World War II might never really happen, but big wars between the Abbasid and the Chinese especially would become inevitable. The Chinese would, in contrast to the Abbasids, probably use steam technology and overpower the Abbasids on land due to their higher manpower, but on sea they would just be able to control their main trade routes between China and the east coast of America. It is very likely that at one point the Abbasids would also control the western part of the Americas, and also with the invention of weapons of mass destruction, neither China nor the Abbasid Empire would be able to lead a direct war, and thus they would compete for space. However, due to the better position of the Abbasid and the resources at their disposition, we could see the Abbasids first on the moon. Once they landed on the moon, satellites would be built, an international space station as well. We could even see the colonization of the moon, later on the colonization of Venus, of Mars, the moons of Jupiter, Saturn, until once the Abbasids would reach Alpha Centauri. And even beyond. They could even reach Andromeda. And if they would survive for so long, many trillions of humans could exist throughout the universe, originally coming from the Abbasid Empire. A very ASB scenario, but who knows, maybe there is a reality like this. I hope you enjoyed this video, and see you next time on Planet Althistory.